Ladies and gentlemen, we will be concluding this conference now. We are going to proceed with a brief summation. I'll be making some remarks. Marvin Kalb will be doing a basic summation. We'll continue those remarks, and Secretary Baker will make some final concluding remarks. Before that, Mr. Nakayama, the former Foreign Minister of Japan, would wish to present to Secretary Baker for the Baker Institute a token of appreciation. We will now proceed with that. Mr. Nakayama. I think this is what.
Thank you very much.
Could you open?
Yes.
The minister said this is a small gift in memory of the Baker Institute. Mr. Nakayama said this is Japanese-style boxing and grading. An enigma wrapped in a riddle. A painting of a peacock. It's an antique painting of a peacock.
Thank you very much, Taro. This is beautiful, and we will hang it in our new building once we move into the building. And we're so grateful to you for this, but we're particularly grateful to you for flying all the way across the Pacific to participate with us. Thank you very much.
Gorgeous.
It's beautiful.
We're now going to ask Marvin Kalb to do the impossible after I make some remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, I'm struck as we wind up the conference by just how much we've covered in such a short period of time. But then the subjects before us have been extraordinarily complex, as you've heard, and they've been very important ones. That we covered them with the thoroughness we did and the incisiveness is a comment, above all, on our moderator, Marvin Kalb, who has shown us once again why his name is a byword for excellence in the world of journalism. I believe that Marvin... With 34 years of government behind me, I like to think of myself as a pro when it comes to foreign policy. But over the last day and a half, I can say very honestly that I have discovered new facts, new insights, and new perspectives, and connections that I did not see before. And I think from that point of view, our conference has made a meaningful contribution to our understanding of the key issues that the panelists addressed on the progress of economic reform in Russia and China, the future of warfare, and the role of culture, religion, and ethnicity in world affairs, and I hope that you agree. On behalf of the Baker Institute, I would like to thank everyone involved in the conference: President Bush, our distinguished panelists, President Malcolm Gillis, the faculty, staff, and students of Rice University, our many supporters here in the nation and around the world. and especially you, our audience. And I would like to remind you that this inaugural conference is precisely that, the first of a series of similar events of quality on other domestic and foreign policy issues that we intend to hold annually during the years to come. Our eyes are firmly fixed on the future. We understand that our final success as an institute will be determined by the contribution that we make to our nation's dialogue and debate on vital public policy issues. And that debate, like the world we live in, is constantly changing, as we've seen during the course and heard during the course of the last day and a half. Yesterday morning, Malcolm Gillis said that this conference was about making a difference. With this conference, we have begun making that difference, and I am intensely grateful to those who have made it possible. Thank you very, very much. I would now like to turn to Marvin Kalb for his summation of the conference, after which Secretary Baker will make his concluding remarks. Marvin?
Thank you, Ed, very much. To summarize a conference of this sort, by definition, is an extremely difficult thing to do. And I was reminded of a story that takes me back almost 9 years when I went to do my first lecture as a Harvard professor. I bumped into John Kenneth Galbraith, who looked at me and said, "Marvin, you look absolutely green." I said, "Well, Ken, this is an important moment in my life. I'm going to be doing my first lecture as a Harvard professor." He said, "Don't worry about it all that much." He said, "At Harvard, there is no thought that is so awesome, that is so complex, that is so totally death-defying, that you can't reduce it to a 50-minute lecture." He said, "On the other hand, there is no thought at Harvard that is so trivial, so absolutely dismissible and unimportant that we cannot inflate it into a 50-minute lecture." So with that kind of thought, I decided to plunge ahead right now and first and most sincerely extend my congratulations to Secretary Baker and Ambassador Deregian. I have told them this privately, but I feel it ought to be said publicly. 9 years ago, I got into the business of trying to formulate a public policy institute. It's called the Shorenstein Center at the Kennedy School at Harvard. It is a very difficult thing to do. It takes a lot of time to establish yourself on the map and to do it with legitimacy, dignity, and a degree of flair. And this group to my right has done it so quickly. They have rocketed into prominence, and my hat off to them and to the people at Rice for having done that. I also want to congratulate all of the members of the panel who put up with the arbitrary whip that I occasionally exercise to keep everything in line. As I pointed out yesterday, it was simply with a desire to keep things fair and to give everyone an opportunity to express their views. Some of these people, as the Secretary said yesterday, crossed the Pacific and crossed the Atlantic to come here, and they deserve their opportunity to have their say. And to have their say in an orderly and civilized fashion, and not in the way in which a number of people could erupt a discussion such as we were having today, and somebody here posing as a journalist yesterday erupting the discussion as well, and disrupting, the discussion. I think they are real-life examples of extremism at work and examples of the kind of thing that we find all over the world and even in the United States. I was extremely pleased this morning to pick up the Houston Chronicle and to read the editorial which has to do with the Baker Conference. And let me just read one point which I think runs through much of what we have heard the last day and a half. Too frequently, the debate in this country is framed as domestic issues versus foreign policy. But the message being made clear at the Baker Institute is that the two are one. And that is certainly the case. I have heard that message articulated not only by Secretary Baker and by President Bush, but I've also heard it articulated by the current National Security Counselor in the Clinton White House and by the President himself. So that this is a bipartisan understanding of the responsibility of American power in the world. It does not stop at the water's edge. That responsibility carries on in a global context, and it is part of the responsibility of being a great power to simply understand that we are not only of the world, but in many cases we are looked upon as the leader of the world. And when the United States, as it did in the Persian Gulf, decides that a major action has to be undertaken, we will find our allies and they will come along with us. However, I have to point out also that the experience that I had in late June of this year in San Francisco, I was honored to have been asked by the UN to moderate, forever moderating, to moderate a panel that had to do with 50 years, the UN's birthday. It was an extraordinary event. It was 3 days in San Francisco that I am not apt to forget for a long, long time. The President showed up, the Secretary of State showed up, our ambassador to the UN showed up, the ambassadors of 180 countries showed up. It was an extraordinary event. Not a single Republican leader showed up. Not even the governor of the state of California, who was literally 20 minutes away in a cab. And they didn't show up because for some reason or other this was the wrong message that the Republican leadership of the Congress today wanted to put out. It seems to me that that is the wrong message for the Republican Party to pull out, because this is not all branches of the Republican Party true, but it is the group that is currently in power, and they didn't find it important enough to be there to honor that moment when 50 years ago this country and many others joined forces to set up the UN. With all of its problems, it is still there, and it seems to me that this theme of neo-isolationism, which did come up at our conference, and came up in a number of different ways. It came up first when President Bush spoke about it yesterday morning. It came up when Secretary Baker talked about it, and it came up when a number of panelists talked about it. This is not a new theme in American life. Isolationism has been there before, but somehow or another, in my view anyway, it is a particularly negative force today when the world is so much smaller. One of the themes raised here by Ralph Begleiter yesterday and by so many other people in the panels was the power of a shrinking world with expanding technology. And that expanding technology has a power the likes of which we do not fully grasp yet. The odd thing is that the people who have the power, who exercise that power, in newsrooms, CNN particularly, are themselves unaware of the power that they are exercising because in their minds they are making purely journalistic decisions. But journalistic decisions today have implications for public policy that are awesome. Now, I am not saying that a journalist has to sit back before doing any story and say, my God, what impact is this going to have on world peace? Although it wouldn't be a bad idea. But it is a suggestion that journalists be aware of a responsibility broader than the newsroom itself. And I think that that is one of the themes that did emerge in our conference. Let me run through a number of the other major themes as they struck me, and Ambassador Derejian will no doubt pick up many, many things that I missed. But the central issue around the world today is the process of economic reform in both Russia and in China. How that goes may well determine the shape of the 21st century, the way in which our children live and the way in which this country can continue to prosper. We cannot turn our backs on that because what happens there is intimately connected with the way in which we conduct our own lives, both foreign and domestic policy. We were told that the reforms in both countries are unavoidable and cannot be reversed. I happen to agree with that. I think that is certainly the case. It is, however, problematic at this point what the economic reforms in China will mean for political reforms in China. And our panelists were cautious on this particular point. My own gut feeling is that the people who run China today will pass from the scene probably more quickly than we imagine. And when they pass from the scene, the enormous latent talent of the Chinese people talent will burst to the surface. And when it does, the kind of economic records that are being set in China today are going to look modest by comparison. Russia is a somewhat different story. Russia does not have the tradition of economic entrepreneurship, and yet I think it is doing remarkably well given the short period of time in which economic reform exists. Forgive me, but I forgot who made the point that Russia pretends to reform and the West pretends to give aid to Russia. Remember that this whole question of aid to Russia has been one with us for some time. The late President Nixon in 1992 presented a series of ideas that added up to a bottom line of $30 billion a year for 5 years. He also, I think, played a Yeltsin card much too exclusively, and I think that if this policy had been pursued, we would be behind the 8 ball. However, I like very much the kind of things that Peter Rosenblatt is doing and his group is doing in Russia today. Find those areas of possible economic activity that are manageable, that are not under tight government control, but give the Russian people an opportunity to flower on their own. They can, and I think they will, if given that kind of an opportunity. But if everything is funneled through a state government in which corruption is rampant, there is no doubt in my mind that more than 50% of the aid is going to end up in Swiss bank accounts. Another major theme had to do with the way in which we define the world in the post-Cold War period. Surely any of you who have sat through the 3 forms understand that this is incredibly difficult to define. If there is a single word that will define the post-containment policy, it is uncertainty. That word came up time and time again in all of the panel discussions. Uncertainty, the central theme. Ministers Duma and Genscher spoke about it. They also spoke about the need for new formulas. And of course, there is that need, and of course, the world is crying out right now for a collection of wise men and women who will sit down and come up with some organizing principle for national and international activity in the post-Cold War world. We cannot continue to use that, forgive me, cliche to define the challenge before us. We've got to somehow master that challenge. General Powell, talking about the Persian Gulf exercise where the U.S. sent 500,000 troops into Saudi Arabia in order to repel Iraqi aggression from Kuwait, suggested that that is a new form of post-Cold War use of American military power. Forgive me, but it sounds like an old-fashioned use of American military power. It worked, and we all take our hats off to the success of the operation. But that be something new, I wonder about. It sounds to me like a new application of the fears that arose during the Vietnam period, when we felt ourselves being sucked gradually into a quagmire, and what is being said now is none of that gradual stuff. If you have an issue, and if the American people support you, go for it. And that is what General Powell is saying. Professor Van Cleveld will come up with the idea of intrastate warfare supplanting interstate warfare. Well, maybe so, and there certainly is a lot of that. Professor Russett comes up with a somewhat different analysis of the way in which we see ourselves, starting with the proposition that democracies do not fight other democracies. Also, that where you have tight and tightening international economic alignments and arrangements, that too encourages the absence of a military option and encourages the presence and the use of economic and political dialogue, particularly when there is a basis in international law. I've already talked about the CNN effect. It is an extraordinary, powerful instrument in the way in which public policy today is carried out. This morning, we heard so eloquently about the rise of religion or fundamentalism in religion as this new force. And listening to it, I wondered in part whether I was listening to a refrain on old wine in new bottles. Remember that 200 years ago or so, it was the West that emerged out of a tradition in which religion played fundamental importance in the way in which politics was played out. We had theocratic regimes, and we have some of that now. But it seems as if we are returning to a phenomenon in world history that we have had a lot of experience with, except that the world has changed so radically since that time. So after 70 years of containment, we are all seeking new definitions for a new era, and I feel myself privileged to have been part of this conference at the Baker Institute, because I have a feeling that it's going to be at places like this that the effort to define the post-Cold War world will actually happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Marvin, for that excellent summation. I would just like to fill in a few footnotes along the basic themes that you've very brilliantly summarized of our deliberations. One important point, I think, was made, I think Bob Zellick made it, that economic reform requires a political base and that the rule of law is essential for economic reforms to prevail. And we see this not only in the countries we discussed, but we could certainly apply that to south of the border, very close to us here, into Mexico. Another subset of what Marvin referred to is that economic security is no longer dependent on territorial security or military domination, and now strength depends on openness for competitive ideas. And again, the information revolution plays a very key role in that. I think one of the important things in the discussion on China was that as China struggles through this reform process, the question of China's national unity has to be looked at very, very closely as what impact reforms will have on the integrity of the Chinese state and the risks and dangers of separatism and where that could go. But certainly a clear message came out that instability of China would impact very negatively on the international order, or whatever we're calling it, in this period. A consensus certainly arose that the West has to give strong support not only to Russia and China, but also to the newly independent states that are emerging around Russia. And certainly Central Asia is a very important part of this. And I think Gerald Parsky made an interesting comment that when we look at reform programs, and as a businessman, I think this is very insightful. He said, are property rights being protected? And who is making the decisions on the application of capital? These are hard-nosed, sensible guidelines that we need to put into our own policy approaches. I think Hans-Dietrich Genscher made a very important point that a just and stable peace in Europe can only be achieved with and not against Russia. And I think this is a very important factor for us to consider. And Roland Dumas made a very important point as to the future of Europe. We shouldn't be preoccupied with Europe's unity merely along security lines and talking about NATO and just the extension of NATO and a partnership for peace, but to look at also the option of economic integration of Eastern Europe and Russia into the larger community of the industrial democracies. And so accession to the Western European Union, to other European countries, is perhaps a good substitute to NATO adhesion, or should complement it in a way that we are not just being unilateral in our approach to Europe and Eastern Europe and Russia, but take in the economic dimension. And again, I think there was a general consensus that our economic institutions are more robust than our security institutions, and obviously we need to find some balance in that. And lastly, I think Marvin summarized on panel 3, I think the whole message of that panel, and that I thought it was a brilliant discussion amongst the panelists, was that during the Cold War, we were so fixated on basic realpolitik, the balance of power, MAD, mutual assured destruction, that the role of religion, culture, and ethnicity was submerged. And this is indeed, I think, the lesson that we can draw from the last panel, is that this great underestimated factor in world politics and domestic politics must now come to the fore in our policy making. And I'm happy to say that the Baker Institute, our very first Baker Institute policy study, will be published next week and disseminated to our mailing list, and I hope to a maximum number of people here. And if you'd like to get it, write in. The theme is the U.S. policy thought Islam and the arc of crisis. So we are taking this on in a very frontal way. Thank you very much. I'd now like to introduce Secretary Baker.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have only a few wrap-up comments. First of all, I'd like to suggest to you that those of you who attended this morning's session were extraordinarily fortunate. It's not often that you can come to a panel discussion on foreign policy challenges and be witness to a tag team wrestling match like we had this morning by a crew from Lyndon LaRouche's presidential campaign, but I thought that enlivened the proceedings a little bit, so we're all fortunate to have had that experience. I thought the panel this morning was really terrific, and one of the panelists made the point that mullahs are having a lot of impact on foreign policy in some states, that rabbis indeed have an impact on foreign policy in Israel, that religious leaders and preachers, I think the panelists said, even have an impact on domestic and foreign policy in the United States, and that we need political leaders who speak in the language of religion. I worked for a political leader who spoke in the language of religion. His name was Ronald Reagan. I say that because it permits me to share a story that Ronald Reagan always used to tell with you. A story about a fellow from our home state here of Texas who wanted to be a farmer. And he bought some land down here, and it was very poor land. It had a lot of brush on it and a lot of rocks on it. But he really worked hard day and night to be the very best farmer and create the very best farm he could. And he was so proud of his farm that he decided to ask his preacher down to see it. And as they were walking along that day, they came to the first plot of ground, and the preacher picked up a cantaloupe melon off the ground, and he said, "Look at this luscious, juicy, ripe, delicious cantaloupe." He said, "God is good." And they went to the next plot, and he pulled an ear of corn off the stalk, and he said, "In this sweet white corn," he said, "praise the Lord." And they went to the third plot, and he picked a tomato off the vine, and he said, "And look at this juicy, ripe tomato." He said, "The Lord has really blessed this place." And the farmer was getting a little bit nervous. Pretty soon he turned over and looked up at him, and he said, "Preacher," he said, "I wish you could have seen this place when the Lord was taking care of it all by himself." Not a bad story. All I really want to do is, I'd like to second Ed Dirigian's comments about our moderator, Marvin Kalb. Marvin, you did an absolutely outstanding job from beginning to end, and we're very much in your debt for coming down here, and we hope that you'll want to do this again when we have our next annual conference. I think really, ladies and gentlemen, that this conference should be seen as part of an ongoing and broader debate, one that's occurring here and around the world about some of the dramatic changes that have swept this globe in recent years. The point of the book that I've just recently completed is that in just 3.5 years of service as Secretary of State of this great nation, the world as I had known it my entire adult life changed.
changed irrevocably because of so many fundamental things that happened. And I hope that our conference over these last 2 days will or has served in a modest way to help set the terms of that ongoing debate about the dramatic changes that are taking place in the world, and that it will help those of you who have attended and those who will read the outstanding papers that were developed for this conference and will read the transcript of the conference to identify trends and to delineate some options and to sketch out some potential solutions to these problems. I think that these deliberations can make, and this is one of the ideas behind the Baker Institute, can make a meaningful contribution to our understanding of some of these important issues that the world faces at the end of the 20th century. And we do not intend to concentrate just on international affairs or foreign policy issues. We will be having seminars and conferences on some of the important domestic issues as well. None of what's taken place here over the past 2 days would have been possible without the extraordinarily talented panelists, and I want to personally thank each and every one of them who was willing to come here and to participate, whether they came all the way across the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean, as indeed many of them did, or whether they came from the Department of History here at Rice University. I think our panelists have been terrific, and I want to personally express my appreciation to them. From the very inception of this institute, it's been committed to the idea of trying to bridge the gap between the world of ideas and the world of action. And I think over the past couple of days we've seen precisely how productive that can be when you get a chance to bring policymakers, former policymakers, current policymakers, scholars, businessmen, and journalists together in a forum where we are free to exchange ideas very frankly and very candidly, and we're free to disagree. I suspect that all of our panelists, however experienced and knowledgeable they are, will leave this conference, hopefully at least, with a richer and more nuanced understanding of the issues that we've addressed. And I think so will all of us, those of us who've been in the audience for much of the presentation. I know that all of us here join me in extending to those participants our heartfelt appreciation for their attendance, as you've just demonstrated. And I'd also like to personally thank Malcolm Gillis and the faculty and the staff of this wonderful university. Without their efforts, this conference quite simply would not have been possible. And there's another point I want to make that I frequently make when I talk about the Baker Institute, and that is that the Baker Institute is really not just located here at Rice University. The Baker Institute is an integral part of Rice University. We are very privileged by our association with Rice, and I think it's one of the strengths of our institute that we are of the university. And let me say that my final thanks go to those of you in the audience, because when all is said and done, you're going to be the final judges of the conference's success or failure, because it is you as citizens who are going to play the role of carrying on the debate about foreign policy when this conference is over. So I hope you found these proceedings informative and thought-provoking. Your presence here has done honor to everybody associated with the conference, and your participation has, in a very fundamental sense, made all of this worthwhile. Thank you very, very much for coming. We look forward to seeing you at our next conference. Thank you very much.